Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of the Daily Run. I said that we're playing as Azazel. So first of all, this particular daily is actually the one from Wednesday and not today. And the reason for that is I knew I was going to be busy on Friday, so I know I will be busy on Friday from my perspective. And from your perspective, I knew I will be busy today, so I recorded the daily on a Wednesday, so I have something to upload on Friday, essentially. I try to upload every single day for better or for worse, usually for worse, because sometimes, you just put up content that is not topical, like in this case, but still, I hope we're going to be able to have some nice chats and just talk about certain things in Isaac. The one thing I do want to talk about in this particular one is the fact that a lot of items that were added in Afterbirth and Afterbirth Plus have a lot of really unique, interesting effects that you just don't get to see maybe because there's so much content in the game. It's just so rare to actually experience synergies that those items were intended to have, essentially. And one of the prime examples of that really suffers from that is an effect like Trinket smelter, or just the idea of gulping trinkets in general. It's a really neat effect, because essentially it allows you to hold an infinite amount of trinkets at the same time. Now, having choice in Isaac is very important. It's very much a game that relies on you making choices, whatever certain things are good or bad. An item is rarely always good and rarely always bad. There are always situations where the same item or the same trinket can actually turn out to be either just something that's hugely positive or something that's hugely negative. And the way to get around that, or at least with trinkets, is the fact that you can drop them on the ground. And that's very useful, because if you find a trinket that maybe doesn't work really well, or maybe you find a better trinket, you want to replace a particular one, you drop both of the trinkets on the ground, if you have two, for example, and you would replace one with the better one, or at least with the one that wouldn't have a negative effect. And now, this is where the limitation of the engines come in, because what ends up happening if you have 3 or maybe 4 or 5 trinkets at the same time? Dropping them all on the ground and picking them up would be very cumbersome. So there are some practical limitations as to how to implement it. Like, for example, do you maybe want to keybind one trinket, for example, per one key button on your keyboard? Again, that seems a little bit impractical. So how do you really elegantly solve this? And Trinket Smelter, I think, is actually a really good idea on how to approach it. Sure, you lose some of that autonomy of dropping a trinket, but the thing is, you also have to make an active decision on when you want to smelt a trinket. And in the case of the gulp pill, because sometimes, you can actually use it without realizing it's a gulp pill because they're unidentified at the start, it can really provide for some interesting moments where you maybe gulp something that you necessarily didn't really want to gulp in the first place. So for example, you have something like snake worm, is it snake worm? The one that makes the tears go in a sine wave or whatever. So if you have that and maybe you don't really want to pick that up, but you accidentally use the gulp pill because, you forgot that even exists in the game, that can really kind of make the run a little bit more interesting. Is it annoying? Sure, but I think it happens rarely enough that it's more of a novel experience than something that's actually an active detriment to the game. And it's not that any particular trinket is just so bad that it's going to ruin your run. I'm sure you can find maybe an instance or two, or like a scenario where a trinket would just ruin you. I'm sure that exists because this is this game. It's designed to troll you in some way. But having the ability to smelt and just eat multiple trinkets is a really elegant solution to essentially having multiple trinkets at once. And in this particular run, I got to experience some of that at the start. Sadly, I still didn't have the run ever since Afterbirth Plus came out, or at least ever since this mechanic was introduced, that would allow me to just have a run where my primary power would be derived from having a bunch of really good trinkets that I've smelted. So something in the case of, for example, having not Acid Baby, but for example, having something like the backpack, which would allow you to have 2 active items, and maybe one of them would be Mom's Box and the other one would be Trinket Smelter, or just having a Trinket Smelter and have a bunch of trinkets appear all over the place. Now, that hasn't happened to me yet, and it's very understandable as to why that didn't happen. Like, obviously, all of those circumstances to get all of those items, or just that everything lines up perfectly, is very, very rare, and for that reason, I'm kind of ashamed, not ashamed, it is a little bit of a shame, in some sense, that this doesn't happen, because it seems like it would be a very fun, interesting challenge. Now, I don't know if there's a challenge run dedicated to this, but basically a challenge run where every single item room is replaced by a trinket and you have Trinket Smelter, or maybe just increased chance of getting a particular trinket. That would be really interesting, I think, because it would allow you to see if you really can derive all of that power just from essentially smelting trinkets. And you would have some autonomy in choosing which trinkets to smelt in the first place, so it wouldn't be like you have to smelt all of the trinkets and get all of the effects. I'm sure that's something you can do as well, and I bet there's a challenge out there that does something similar to that. But I would just like to outline just how interesting trinkets are in some cases, and just how well this really works when you have something like Mom's Box and when you have the trinket smelter. And I just wanted to experience more of that. I think I gulped like 5 or 6 trinkets in this particular run, which is obviously very way above average just to a regular run, but still, it oftentimes doesn't feel meaningful or impactful enough. It just doesn't feel like it added or changed the run in a significant way. Sure, I have some effects, that work in the background, but there's really no way to check which trinkets I've already smelted, what they provide for me, unless I kind of memorize everything, but again, I think that's a little bit impractical. So what ends up happening is you just have these passive effects, and you're not really sure what they do, right? And it's just like, okay, sure, maybe I have a little bit of a higher damage, maybe there are a little bit more chances of me getting, I don't know, a red heart or a key. And I think in some sense that's the problem of design of the trinkets, because a lot of the trinkets aren't all that involved, and that's a huge shame, because I feel like that's the one spot where things could be actively different. Trinkets could have that hard swing when they would go into one extreme or the other, and then you can decide if you want to pick it up or if you want to leave it on the ground, because they have the innate property of the fact that they're being able to drop it on the ground, and you can kind of make a value judgment based on that. And I think that's what would make trinkets interesting. Having a trinket, I think in general, that just increases the odds of, I don't know, you getting a key, or the fact that it just increases your damage or your range, just doesn't seem all that appealing to me. And the fact that trinkets like that exist, I feel like are just padding of the content. And I do understand that to a certain extent some padding has to happen, right? Because there's so many things in the game, and you want to have some bad items to balance out the good items. But I don't think a bad item constitutes... I don't think a bad item is the same as a not interesting item. I feel like there are ways to add bad items to the game which would be remotely interesting. Now, one of the ideas I've had, and I actually implemented it in the modding tools, was a trinket called Hemorrhoids. And I really like the idea of that because, okay, so what it does, essentially it replaces every single poop on the ground with red poop. And you might be like, wait, that actually sounds horrible, why would you want that? But the thing is, a lot of the rooms actually have poop on the ground already, so if you pick up that particular trinket, it can actually be very useful in dealing with the enemies that you encounter. Another benefit of it is the fact that as soon as you enter the room, it actually triggers all of the poops in the room at the same time, and it gives you all of the drops that they contain. So that's also really good, because it kind of saves you a lot of time, so you don't have to go by and check every single one of them one by one to get all of the loot that they actually hide within. So in some sense, it's both a positive and a negative, but what allows it to be so, what I would say, extreme in one direction or the other, is exactly precisely the fact that you can drop it on the ground and that you can pick it up whenever you want, and you can kind of tailor your run based on that. So if there was an item, for example, that made you immune to red poop, and I think something like that exists, for example, Stompy, I think, makes you immune to red poop, at least to a certain extent, having that particular trinket is just a positive, right? It's not a negative, because it always will just save you time, and it will always just serve as an additional source of damage against the enemies in the room. So, I think trinkets should go more in that direction, maybe not that particular example because it's an extreme example, and obviously I'm very biased because I made the item in the first place, but still, I think it's something to be considered, something to be thought about, just in general, because I like talking about things like this in these videos. So we did finish in the 17th place, no thanks to the trinkets we smelted. This run was actually just bonkers. We got so much damage throughout the run, and the fact we had Mom's Box combined with Whipworm, which actually increased our range to a ridiculous amount with Azazel, allowed us to be relatively safe. So I didn't take as much damage as I usually do, but at the same time, I did take a lot more than I probably wanted to. But still, we did manage to finish in the 17th place, and I think that's a pretty good score for today. So with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed this one, guys, and I hope to see you next time.